Want to know just how talent efficient the White Sox roster is? Superstars hypothetically being on the club would still have the Sox losing 90 games. Let's discuss on today's episode of Locked On White Sox.
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm your host, Todd Welter, a lifelong Sox fan and the site expert of SouthsideShowdown.com, part of the Fan Side Network. And also, I've covered Major League Baseball for outlets such as the Associated Press. And thanks for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure to hit the like button on today's episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox if you've not done so already. And also follow or subscribe to the show at wherever you get your podcast. Well, Fangraphs' Dan Szymborski, who came up with the ZiPS projection formula, tweeted out that he ran a projection with the Sox having 3 superstars, and the Sox would still lose 90 games. So let's discuss just how that is another example of how far the Sox have to go to get back to being competitive. Speaking of getting back to being competitive, the Detroit Tigers were like the White Sox 2 decades ago and went from 119 losses in 2003 to the World Series in 2006. I spoke with Adam Dubbin, assistant editor of SB Nation's Bless You Boys, to discuss how that turnaround happened. And then finally, let's discuss if the Sox should be declared the loser in last year's Aaron Bummer trade. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So a lot is being made about the Sox win projection total being 60 wins, and how it's mostly going to be because variance hopefully favors the Sox enough to at least get back to baseball's minimal standards. PECOTA and ZiPS has sort of given that disclaimer that the 2025 White Sox team is still not very talented. So there is a possibility they might not even make it to 60 wins. And I do actually plan on getting Jordan Lazowski from Sox on 35th on next week to really break this all down, as he had an excellent thread on X-Phone Twitter to those that are like, well, if the Sox didn't get any better, how are they going to win 20 more games from the 2024 season where they lost 121 games? How would that happen? So Jordan Lazowski is going to join me next Wednesday to actually break that down. But then Dan Szymborski ran some projections that really showed just how far away the White Sox are from being competitive. And that is why I caution you, my fellow Sox fans, friends, to just watch for hopefully the arrow pointing up when the 2025 season ends. For those that actually have a little bit of hope, and I'm not telling you how to fan, but just know that there's probably not a path to overachieving. It's going to be very hard. And for those screaming for owner Jerry Reinsdorf to spend money, he should have spent money after the 2024 debacle. Well, Szymborski ran a simulation where the Sox would have Shohei Ohtani, Aaron Judge, and Tariq Skubal without having to give up anything. And I've got the tweet up here for those watching on YouTube. Here's what he writes. Just for fun, and this is at D. Szymborski. Just for fun, for the extremely preliminary current ZiPS projected standings for the AL Central. That is the AL Central if the White Sox acquired Shohei Ohtani, Aaron Judge, and Tariq Skubal for free. For those sitting on YouTube, but for those watching on the or listening on the wherever you get your podcast, he's got the White Sox going 72-90 and still finishing dead last. That's right. If the Sox somehow had 2 MVP players and the reigning AL Cy Young pitcher on their roster, didn't have to give up anything. Let's say they were free agents and they did this major spending spree, they would still lose 90 games. I mean, that wouldn't even make the Sox a contender, adding those 3 major upgrades. Although, however, after enduring the 2024 season, jumping to 90 losses, honestly, I think would earn a parade. If you jumped from, to 70, from 41 wins to 72 wins, Will Venable could potentially get manager of the year consideration, But Szymborski even ran a simulation where the Sox signed Alex Bregman, and well, it only moves the Sox playoff odds from 0% to 0.1%. And again, why bring this up? Fan how you want. But I do see in the comments, and I do see some folks on Twitter that are like, well, they could overachieve. That they could win 70 games. They could. Overachievement's going to be really, really hard. It's highly, highly unlikely. And also, those that jump in the comments and those that keep doing the stereotypical complaints, just asking maybe to stop, because spending or no spending, the White Sox are still projected to be terrible. I mean, Szymborski literally put it in the numbers, and I know it's a computer, and I know he probably only ran one simulation. But if you added 2 MVP players and the reigning AL Cy Young winner, you're still a loser. They would still have a losing team. They'd basically be the Los Angeles Angels when they had Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani. And that's why I suggest the laments toward Jerry Reinsdorf, at least for this season. Please just stop with the non-spending money. No problem. I don't want to tell you how to fan, but again, chant sell the team to voice your displeasure. I'm all for that. I endorse that. Don't boo the team, chant sell the team. But a spending spree was not going to turn this franchise into this year's Kansas City Royals because they still have a bunch of either unknown talent or known talent that doesn't include Bobby Witt Jr. That's why Chris Getz was right to say this was not the offseason to spend. That's why I'm also going to suggest the focus has to be, for the next couple of years during this rebuild, has to be on what Chris Getz and Mike Shirley do in the next couple of drafts. The focus also has to be on what David Keller, the new director of international scouting, even though he's got a different title, does in the next couple of international free agent signing classes. What matters is his talent has to come in, and then it just can't be from flipping good players and it has to stop being from, well, we just have to flip our good players in offseason trades or at the trade deadline. That has to stop. You want to see talent be drafted and signed through international free agency, and then Paul Janisch, Ryan Fuller, and Brian Bannister and the minor league coaching staff at all four levels develop these players into big league baseball players, whether it's 1 to 2 WAR players or all the way up to 6 WAR players. That has to be the focus from here on out for this organization. Because for those that are saying, again, that are upset, and I'm not a fan of Jerry Reinsdorf's limited spending, but he's only going to authorize so much spending if the White Sox can lay the foundation this year. Because 2025 and 2026 has to be a foundation-laying season. And it also has to be, again, these next 2 drafts are very, very important for how for the future trajectory of this franchise. But get that, get all these guys developed, and then it's up to Will Venable to push the right buttons to get those players into position to win ball games. It's up to Will Venable's coaching staff to make sure the team is ready to play the game and win the game that is in front of them today. So that's why I got no problem actually with Chris Getz banging the drum on the front office changes that he's put into place, because that's what really needed to happen this offseason. How the team goes about evaluating prospects and developing them has to be updated. Using data and modern pitching and hitting ideas had to be brought into this organization. Basically, the organization had to stop operating like it was 2005 in 2025. On the flip side, since the White Sox do not have any really good established big league talent outside of Luis Robert Jr., who they're trying to trade, and I've talked about on many episodes, there is still the possibility that things could still be really bad in 2025, just like it was in 2024. I do want to bring that up because Mike Baumann of Fangraphs, he wrote this about the White Sox projected to win 62 games, and I don't know where he got the 4% chance of making the playoffs. I didn't see that in the Zips projection. I thought the Zips had it at like 0.1 or 0, but either way, he has that there's a 4% chance of making the playoffs. This is what he writes. It might shock you to learn that a team that set the major league record for losses in a season underachieved a little. Chicago's Pythagorean record was actually 7 games better than the real world record, which means that according to the run differential, the White Sox should have gone 48 and 114. So let's take that as a baseline and start with a question. Do you know who Penn Murphy is? He's a 30-year-old reliever who had a good year for Seattle in 2022, after which he's been waived or released 6 times since Halloween 2023. Zips has him projected for a 4.27 ERA, which is the lowest number for anyone currently on the White Sox pitching staff. The worst team in modern history traded Eric Fetty, Tommy Pham, and Michael Kopech midseason, and jettisoned Garrett Crochet at the winter meetings. Their big free agent pickups have been Martin Perez, Mike Tauchman, Josh Rojas, which are the kind of names you'd run into during a particularly disappointing trade deadline from the Neil Huntington era Pirates. I don't think the White Sox will lose 120 games again, but I don't think they'll be a less talented, but I do think they'll be a less talented team. And then he writes, I just want to reiterate that projections are usually pretty conservative, so it takes some doing to get the machine to spit out a 100-loss prediction. Even so, I think the playoff odds are being too kind. Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. If you added Scooble, Shohei Ohtani, and Aaron Judge in an alternate reality, it still doesn't even make the White Sox a playoff team. They'd have to add more and more pieces probably to get them up. And even if you added Alex Bregman still wouldn't do anything. So that's why this is going to be a long haul. That's why the focus has to be on what do they do in the draft? What do they do? Even though I said in the beginning, you want to stop flipping veterans for prospect assets. This is definitely a season though where they still have to accumulate assets wherever they can get them. So can they do that at the trade deadline? What do they get in the Luis Robert Jr. trade? Can Luis Robert Jr. hopefully stay healthy and get back to his 2023 levels? But the drafts and the international free agent signing classes, that has to be where this team gets better. Well, the White Sox are not the only team to barely win over 40 games in recent history. The 2003 Tigers almost broke the losing record the Sox just set, and 3 years later, they made the World Series. So let's go over how they did that next on Locked On White Sox. Being a Bears fan means you don't get to see many playoff games. I was lucky enough as a kid to see the Bears play in a few live and in person with my dad when he had his season tickets. And granted, the Dallas Cowboys beat the Bears as they started their 1990s dynasty march. And looking back, it was actually still neat to see Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, and Michael Irvin take their first steps towards winning a Super Bowl. And if you want to catch major events like playoff games live, might I suggest using the Gametime app. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And I'm always checking out the Gametime app for tickets to Marquette basketball home games, my beloved alma mater. Browsing through the deals is simple, and I always find great value for all kinds of seats around the venue. The Super Deal was especially impressive, offering the best value for the event. The app's features like seat views before you buy and all-in pricing with no surprise fees at checkout makes the experience smooth and reliable. Plus, the on-time ticket delivery and lowest price guarantee will give you a peace of mind. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Today, last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, make sure to hit the like button on today's episode and subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox if you've not done so already. And if you can't catch the show on YouTube, Locked On White Sox is available on all major podcast platforms. So make sure to follow or subscribe on places such as Apple or Spotify. Either way, get your 30-minute fix of Chicago White Sox baseball venting with me. Earlier in the offseason, I had Chuck Freeman of Locked On Brewers go over how the Brewers franchise went from rock bottom in 2002 with a terrible owner and eventually turn things around with new ownership, as I wanted to give you a perspective of how things could change with the new owner. As we're always saying, sell the team, Jerry. And again, the Brewers bottomed out in 2002 with 106 losses, and they started laying the foundation. They had an ownership change because Bud Selig was just not rich enough to own a baseball team anymore. Mark Antanasio comes in, makes a couple of extra moves, and lo and behold, the Brewers eventually get to the playoffs in 2008, snapping, I believe it was like a 26-year drought. And also in 2005, they finally made it to 500 after 12 years of never making it to 500. So I kind of want to give you guys that perspective. I believe I did that episode in October or November. You can go back and take a look at that. But let's say Jerry Reinsdorf is still with us and owning the team for the next couple of years. And it is sad that we have to hope he dies for things to possibly get better. But let's say he is. I did want to see if, how maybe that turnaround could happen, because it did. The Detroit Tigers just did that 2 decades ago after they lost 119 games in 2003 and then went to the World Series in 2006, all with Mike Ilyich owning the team. So I sat down with Adam Dubbin of blessyouboys.com, SB Nation's Detroit Tigers fan site, to go over that turnaround. How did the Tigers basically bottom out in 2003 but fall one loss short of breaking the record, where obviously the White Sox blew right past that Mets record?
Yeah, so, as a fan at the time, it was a hard time to be a Tigers fan. I mean, you got to even go back into the 90s, right? That we went through an era where it was just futility, no matter what. Then they signed Juan Gonzalez, built Comerica Park, and the build it and they will come thing never really materialized. So when we got around to 2003, we've got the legend Alan Trammell running the team. But with all the fanfare that came with him, the ownership didn't give him anything to work with, right? And I think there's a parallel maybe that can be seen with the White Sox last year, that at least as an outside observer, that definitely felt like they were working with the bare necessities. And so when we talk about the evolution of the Tigers going from that 2003 to the 2006 World Series, years, probably the landmark event was signing Pudge Rodriguez, right? It was the moment that ownership showed that they were going to put some commitment into the franchise and to building it into something that the fans would want to see, right? Nobody wants to see a losing product. It doesn't matter what sport we're talking about or anything in life. So you get Pudge, and then we picked up Maglio Ordonez, who was injured from the White Sox, and sort of took a flyer out on him. His knee was a questionable thing, but they rolled the dice on him. They also acquired Carlos Guillen, which was a big move. And they ended up getting Ramon Santiago, who they traded for him back, which made that even a more keen trade. So you've got, going into the 2005 season, you got Alan Trammell still at the helm, maybe a little overwhelmed with his job, but they're starting to build something there. And by the time 2006 rolls around, right, they put Alan to the side, and now you've got Jim Leyland. Jim Leyland brings a pedigree of a World Series ring, but also, had dealt with egos like Barry Bonds in the past with the Pirates. He brought a lot to this team that was very young. You've got Justin Verlander in 2006, who was a rookie, who ended up winning, the Rookie of the Year award. But he wasn't the only sub-25 guy on that roster that helped make things happen. So it was sort of an eventual buildup to what happened in 2006, and then adding, Kenny Rogers as a veteran presence. It was an interesting turn of events that led to what was really, honestly, the Tigers getting as far as they did in 2006 was one of those bolts of lightning. Not too different than the Tigers at the end of last season, how they just ran off all those wins to make it to the playoffs. It was that same kind of baseball magic, to be perfectly honest with you. But you can't have that kind of magic if you don't have certain parts in place.
Yeah, and I like how you actually brought up, capturing lightning in a bottle, because the White Sox won the World Series in 2005 by doing that. The Tigers just fell a little bit short because the other team, the Cardinals, caught lightning in a bottle, and their lightning, was just a little bit, more spark there. The one thing though that I want to highlight too is the Tigers obviously lose 119 games in 2003, but they only get the second pick. Obviously the White Sox lose 121. They're getting the 10th pick, but it turned out pretty well for the Tigers in terms of getting Justin Verlander for all that losing, correct?
Clearly, right? I think that history has shown. But nobody knew that at the time. And, he was a young hurler with, a lot of potential, but, coming out of college, you never really know what you're going to get out of a pitcher, especially that era. It feels like back then it was definitely more hit or miss. But he showed up when it was necessary. He had a great, rookie year. Unfortunately, game one of the World Series was a big downer for him. And I was there before that. That's where I got this. And it was, it was brutal to watch. But, it definitely was an important part of what would become a Tigers dynasty, if we can call it a dynasty, even though they didn't actually win a World Series. But there was a good run there. Where
AL
they
Central
were players
dynasty
every year.
is enough to say. You dominated the AL Central for a while, so I interrupt on that. So if I know my timelines right, Mike Ilitch was the owner at the time, though, of the 03. What got him then to start to say, hey, I got to commit money to get this team? Was it the 119 losses, or was it just, finally, just he decided, I've got a bunch of Little Caesars money here, so I'll just start spending money on the Tigers?
I think honestly, it was sort of, he started to realize he was getting long in the tooth. He had bought the franchise from Domino's Pizza, right? So he's Little Caesars, and Domino's had owned it earlier. He had bought them years before, but sort of dragged butt. He had put all his money into the Red Wings. And, as a Red Wings fan myself, I was very appreciative of it. But it certainly it showed on the Detroit Tigers side. And it seems that at some point he just got motivated to put money into the franchise, and and starting with that Pudge Rodriguez signing, which was one of the most lucrative of the time. And nobody wanted to come to Detroit at that time, and much like I imagine a lot of people or a lot of players are reluctant to go to the South Side right now, because it's I would give up $1 million or $2 million if I'm making 7 or 8 just to be on a winning team personally. So that's what they had to do. They had to rebuild the cred of the franchise itself, which had completely crumbled, in the 90s. And then, like I said, at the I think I talked before, the Juan Gonzalez coming in and how that failed, and building Comerica Park, and that was, not a home run hitter's park when they brought a home run hitter. And just so many bad ideas and so many just wrong things were implemented early on that they needed a complete change of course. And spending money was the right idea at the right time.
Yeah, and I do love the parallels too, because you think about it, Jerry Reinsdorf owned the Bulls and put a lot of his money in the 90s into the Bulls, put a little money in the White Sox, but never enough. But then it's just funny because right now he's not putting any money into either team. It's just it's very interesting to me. So how stunned were Tigers fans were in 2020? The White Sox hired Tony La Russa, making AJ Hinch available to the Tigers, because it seems like to me that really is where the two franchises started to converge, going where the White Sox, yes, they win the division in 2021, but then they slowly decay, and the Tigers start building up to getting back to where they make this great run to the playoffs.
Yeah, I would have to start that discussion with how inept the Ron Gardenhire era was in Detroit. And that was a time when I was actually, in Lakeland, Florida, covering minor league and spring training. And it was really embarrassing, quite honestly, the way that they conducted the team. There was no desire to implement any sort of advanced metrics. It was just, everything was just so far behind. And and there was, we as a fan base and as writers generally agree that Gardenhire was just brought in to sort of cushion this big rebuild tear down that they were doing, because they knew the ownership knew that there was going to be a really bad few years, right? And 2019 kind of culminated that mark. So when Hinch became available, it was like a ray of sunshine for us, wasn't it? Suddenly we have somebody who cares, somebody who's going to bring advanced metrics, somebody who is going to use video data and bring in coaches who understood various, pitching grips and shift a seam shifted wake, all these things, all these more advanced things that everybody else is doing, or at least everybody else who's winning is doing, and the Tigers just weren't doing. And so it really was night and day when Hinch came in. Obviously, we had to sort of swallow a little bit of bile with the idea that, he may have cheated, with the Astros. But when you have been through what we went through, at the end of the 2000 teens, you're kind of desperate for anything, aren't you?
Well, the only reason why I was willing to swallow with AJ Hinch is I kind of believe the testimony that I think all the inmates wanted to run the asylum. How do you overcome 25 guys? I mean, hey, he did smash that monitor at least on that.
Yeah.
So are the Tigers capable of making the playoffs yet again, or was this just lightning in a bottle and maybe they return to the mean?
I think that is still to be determined. With the Bregman signing still in the balance, I think a lot of it depends on that. The Tigers, we have a great pitching, not just staff, but our whole pitching development system and Fetter and everybody who's involved are really at the upper cusp finally. And so we've got that going for us, which is nice. But on offense, we were at the bottom end of the league last year. And, early on in the season, there were a lot of games that we lost, by very narrow margins that, a simple base hit, extra base hit, maybe even a home run would solve. So, the idea of adding, a 25 to 30 home run hitter like Bregman or even Alonso would shift the equation a lot in my mind. At this point, I think we're sort of borderline. You need a lot of guys to repeat career performances. I'm not so worried about Scooble, but there's when you've got a manager like Hinch who's able to squeeze every bit of potential out of every player, that doesn't leave you a whole lot of headroom for the next season. And you know that every other team is watching your data, looking at your video, and looking to get ahead of what you did last year. So if you're not moving ahead, you're falling behind. So that's what I'm worried about as far as making the playoffs. If we've got a Flaherty, which bolsters the starting line, the starting rotation, but I'm not so sure what Cobb brings to the mix. Conley could be a great option in the pen, but again, there were other guys we could have signed too. So a lot of us are sort of waiting to see like what kind of magic Hinch and Federer, etc., that all are going to bring to the season.
All right, final question. How are Tigers fans enjoying Jason Benetti calling their games?
Yeah, we love it. He's great. Sorry we had to take him from you, but maybe not sorry. It was brutal for a few years there for us. So it actually makes a much better product, and I hope that every major league team can get somebody like Benetti, or at least somebody on that level on their team, because the sport needs that. We really need great callers who can illustrate the game and bring things home to the people watching.
I'm glad you have an owner that can actually enjoy him eating his food on camera, because that was one of the reasons why Jerry Reinsdorf wanted him gone. Was he didn't like how he ate, and he didn't like his humor in that. And now we're stuck with John Triffin, who has really divided the White Sox fan base. Well, Adam, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, no problem. Have a great one.
The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions of winnings awarded, PrizePicks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2-player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for the big game where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw 1 yard to win. Pair that up with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. And let's say you pair it up with, say, the more or less on Jalen Hurts on 213.5 passing yards, or Travis Kelce having more or less on 6 catches, plus fast, safe withdrawals. So when you win, your cash is in your account in as little as 15 minutes. Check out the promos tab to tail any of the super sweet milling winners big game lineups. If you tail a lineup that goes 3 for 3, you can win a split of $1 million in promo funds. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, shout out to all the everydayers. I appreciate your loyalty. Please hit the like button on today's episode. Recommend to your fellow Sox fans or baseball fans, friends, to subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox, wherever they get their podcasts, as this show is available on all major podcast platforms. So somehow it looks like the White Sox are losing a trade where they traded a left-handed reliever who had an ERA over 6 in 2023 and basically needed great defensive help for him to get outs for 5 players. 1 for 5, and the White Sox are looking like they're definitely going to lose that trade. With Braden Shoemake now being picked up by the New York Yankees after he was DFA'd by the White Sox, that leaves only Jared Shuster and minor leaguer Riley Gowins still left with the White Sox organization in that Aaron Bummer trade. Somehow Chris Getz's first major trade looks awful, even though he did acquire 4 players that were likely to be non-tendered. So that even made that look even worse. Like on paper, I remember when it first happened, I'm like, well, he flipped Aaron Bummer for 5 players. But the speculation at the time was those guys were, 4 of those guys were getting non-tendered. You could have just went for them on the free agent market. But it didn't look like, getting 5 players at the time was going to have a high probability of the White Sox walking away from this deal as a loser. But that's what's happening. Bummer had a 3.58 ERA last season for the Braves in 55 1/3 innings, 69 strikeouts to 18 walks. For comparison, Jared Shuster, one of the parts that the White Sox better hope does better this season to help give the Sox a chance to come out maybe a winner or a tie in this deal. He had a 4.30 ERA with 56 strikeouts and 33 walks. He was part of that bullpen that blew 37 saves. Although I'm not going to say like maybe the White Sox bullpen would have been better if they had Aaron Bummer, because remember, he needs good defense behind him. He had an ERA over 6 in part because he's a ground ball pitcher. He's going to induce contact. He needs, basically his goons, as Barry Bonds calls it, to field the ball. And the Sox defense was still awful in 2024. So I don't think he's putting up the same numbers like he did in Atlanta. Although, again, he kept guys off base. And that was one thing that the White Sox bullpen was terrible at. They were issuing free passes left and right. But, the one thing to look at, too, in the context, though, is there was a chance he could thrive at another team if they had a good defense behind him. So that's the thing. It was like, was that the best deal? Was that the best use of leveraging Aaron Bummer as a trade asset? Because in terms of the rest of the return, Shoemake was terrible in April. Demoted to the minors, never to be heard from again. He was also part of that terrible 2018 first-round draft class. Michael Soroka. Honestly, I actually did not have a problem kicking the tires on him to see if he could stay healthy and regain that dominant 2019 form. I mean, he was a dominant pitcher in 2019. Just injuries kept ravaging his career. So there's nothing wrong with kicking the tires on that. But again, he was looking to be DFA'd. And obviously did not return to the 2019 form, although could have maybe worked out as a bullpen arm. But again, could not stay healthy. And now he's with the Nationals, who think they can get him back to his emerging ace form. Good luck with that. However, now watch. He does turn, he stays healthy, and he turns out to be like Ronaldo Lopez was for the Braves last season, and has a great season in Washington, makes the All-Star team. And again, it looks like anybody who ever leaves the White Sox will thrive. Nicky Lopez, though, was replacement level at second base. He doesn't get tendered, basically gets waived, and he's now with the Cubs. And the reason, again, Getz looks foolish in this trade is he took quantity that he would have likely been able to pursue in the open market. Again, these guys were going to be probably non-tendered. He could have went out and tried to sign them. But then again, one of the reasons those 4 major leaguers probably would have not wanted to come to the White Sox is the White Sox had a terrible free agent reputation. But still, I mean, look at what the White Sox are doing now. They're signing guys like these guys. If you offer enough money, and they did technically offer enough money, they offered a guaranteed deal to Paul DeJong. When Paul DeJong, I believe I did an episode way back when I first started, was saying like, they were the only team that offered me a free agent major league contract. Some of these guys probably would have not. I don't even know if Soroka would have gotten a big league deal. But it just shows you that Getz really wanted them, but he knew he probably wasn't going to be able to get them, so he had to leverage a decent asset because, remember, Bummer still had value. I mean, again, 1 for 5, and the belief was he just needed to go to a team that could back him up defensively. It's more, again, where you're looking like the loser in this is he probably should have tried to leverage Bummer for maybe more quality than quantity. But hey, maybe they still make out, as a winner deal. Shuster, maybe he has a better season. Riley Gowans actually posted a better ERA in AA than single A. Maybe he turns out to be a bullpen arm, but still, you wonder, could Getz have gotten a better deal with another team? Well, that wraps up this edition of Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On MLB. Baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. I'll be back tomorrow to discuss some college baseball players you should pay attention to with the college season about to start, as the Sox, again, need to add more talent in this year's draft. Feel free to leave comments about today's discussion regarding, even if the Sox had superstar players, they would still lose 90 games this year. How the Detroit Tigers turned things around 2 decades ago, and maybe there's a similar path for the White Sox, and how the White Sox are probably the losers in the Aaron Bummer trade. You can leave them at the episode page on YouTube, X, formerly Twitter, at Todd J. Dubb, or at Locked On Sox, or you can email me at lockedonwhitesox@gmail.com. Have a great day. I will see you tomorrow.